Welcome back to my inner sanctum. I'm your hostess, Countess Elizabeth, mistress of the macabre. Zoos traditionally have access to exotic animals from all corners of the globe. Lions, tigers, bears, all of which can be found in the zoo. However, some people like to also keep these exotic animals as pets, perhaps having so many of them that they create their own zoo. Today, my fiends, we will talk about one such person who owned so many exotic animals that he had his own private zoo. Today we will investigate the Zanesville Zoo Massacre. So let us open the cages and observe the chaos so we can explore our grotesque curiosity. On October 18, 2011, in Zanesville, Ohio, Terry Thompson, a Vietnam War veteran and lifelong collector of exotic animals, committed suicide, but not before he released dozens of exotic animals which he owned from their enclosures. The first person to know something was wrong at the Zanesville Zoo was Thompson's neighbor, Sam Kopchak. A little bit before 5 o'clock on that evening, as the day began to ebb away, Sam Kopchak left his home that he shared with his 84-year-old mother and headed into the paddock behind their house to attend to a horse he'd bought 9 days earlier. Red, a half-Arabian pinto horse, was acting skittish and had moved towards the far corner of the field. On the other side of the flimsy fence separating them from his neighbor, Terry Thompson's property, Kopchak noticed that Thompson's horses seemed to have been more agitated. They were circling, and in the center of their troubled orbit, there was some kind of dark shape. Only when the shape broke out of the circle could Kopchak see that it was a black bear. Kopchak wasn't overtly alarmed by this sight, unexpected as it was, maybe because the bear was too big as black bears go, and maybe because it was running away from him. He knew what he'd do: put Red in the barn, go back to the house, report what he'd seen. This plan soon had to be revised. He and Red had taken only a few steps toward the barn when Kopchak saw something else, close by, just ahead of them on the other side of the fence. Just sitting there on the fence, facing their way, was a fully grown male African lion. He didn't know too much about lions, but he had heard it was unwise to challenge them by looking them in the eye, and that if you ran away, they had a tendency to chase you. So he settled on what he considered a brisk walking pace for himself and Red. He had only looked back once when they were about a third of the way to the barn. The lion was in the same place as a moment ago, still on the other side of the fence, though it was quite obvious that the animal could get over the fence anytime it wanted to. Inside the barn, Kopchak locked the doors and telephoned his mother, sitting in front of a TV about 100 yards away back in the house. There was, he told her, a major problem. They'd long known that there were strange and unusual animals kept on Thompson's property. We didn't have any idea how many there were, Mrs. Kopchak would later reflect, but they assumed that these two runaways must have come from there. So first thing Miss Kopchak did was to dial her neighbor's number. No answer. Only then did she call 911 and alert the world. She sounded calm when she reported what her son had seen, as though there was really nothing too strange or alarming about a lion and a bear running loose on an October afternoon in Ohio. Her son remained trapped in the barn. From there, looking through a north-facing window, he watched the menagerie grow. Along came a wolf and a second bear, this one much larger than the first. And there was the lion he had seen before, now pacing back and forth, and also a lioness anxiously scuttering around. And then he says, "I saw a tiger. I'm telling you, the lion is bad enough, and the lioness is bad enough, and the wolf is bad, and the bear, but don't be around the tiger. The tigers are actually bigger than the lions if they're fully grown." The tiger started snarling and went after the horses. Deputy Jonathan Mary was 2 hours into his shift, serving a court summons a couple of miles away in Zanesville, when the call came through about a lion and a bear on the loose. When he arrived, he could see, just inside Thompson's fence, a tiger, a black bear, and 2 lionesses. While he was waiting for Miss Kopchak to answer the door, he saw a large gray wolf running southward along the road behind him. He had set his clipboard on the porch, ran to his patrol car, and followed the wolf. When it turned up towards the house, Mary got his rifle from the trunk and followed on foot. By now the order had come over the radio: put the animal down. It was about 80 yards away from him, but it fell at the first shot. Mary drove back up the hill until he came across a deputy running back and forth near Thompson's driveway. Mary didn't know what was going on, so he stopped, and as he got out of the car, he grabbed for his rifle on the passenger seat, but it snagged on the computer stand, so he left it. That was when he saw the black bear, at first facing him and then running straight towards him. Now he only had his Glock, not the weapon you'd want to use when you're facing a 350 pounds of charging bear. He got off one shot. The black bear fell about 7 feet in front of Mary. After that, Mary went back for his rifle. An African lioness crawled under the livestock fence and ran south down the road, then headed towards someone's home, so he shot her before she could go further. Then he turned back, intending to deal with the black bear and the tiger along the roadway, but he was distracted by a cougar heading south, so he followed the cougar into another driveway where he met a male African lion coming the other way. He shot the lion while some other deputies shot the cougar. Luger. Soon he was instructed to patrol the border between Thompson's property and Interstate 70. And over the evening, he shot another wolf, 2 more lions, a tiger, and later on, a grizzly bear. Nobody knew where Thompson was, and there was much concern for his safety. Maybe the animals had somehow busted out and he was injured in need of help. After Deputy Mary headed down the road in pursuit of a wolf, Sergeant Steve Blake, who had first been on the scene, decided that he should drive up to the Thompsons' house. As he neared the farm buildings, he saw more animals. Their cages had either been cut through or left open. Blake sounded his horn outside of Thompson's house, but there was no response. So he drove back, and at the foot of the drive he met John Moore, a caretaker who regularly fed the animals and had been alerted by a phone call from someone in the neighborhood. Together they returned to the house, finding nothing but 2 monkeys and a dog in cages. But on their way back to the road, Moore spotted a body near the barn. A white tiger appeared to be eating it, and they couldn't get any closer. Eventually, the Columbus Zoo officials were called in for help. That evening, the zoo assembled its capture and recovery team, armed with both tranquilizer dart guns and regular weapons, and set out for Zanesville. Meanwhile, at the gateway of Thompson's property, the police were wondering how many animals might be on the loose. John Moore mentally ran through the row of cages he would feed. The final total was 56. That was when Moore told Deputy Jeff Lecoq something that would later appear in the official police report and came to be taken as a kind of explanation for what had happened, albeit one that prompted many further questions. Moore said that he had last spoken with Thompson at 9 o'clock the previous evening, and that Thompson, who was 62, had told Moore about a letter he had received from an unwanted author saying that his wife, Marion, had been unfaithful. Thompson had only returned from a prison sentence 3 weeks before. That's when Terry actually goes to Moore and asks him about Marion having cheated on him while he was in prison, says Deputy Lecoq, and his answer, in the way I recall, was that he didn't know whether she did or didn't. And then Terry makes this statement back to him: "Well, I have a plan to find out, and soon you'll know when it happens." When Deputy Todd Knavel arrived at the scene, Sergeant Blake told him about the body that they had spotted. "I think it's Terry," he said. "I don't know." They needed to find out for sure, and to see whether the person might still be alive. By now they had decided that they would need to neutralize all of the animals that were on the loose, even those still on Thompson's property, so they formed a shooting party. Blake drove Knavel's Silverado crew cab, and 4 others sat on the bed of the truck behind him so that they wouldn't have to fire out of the windows. Deputy Tony Angelo, a sniper for their SWAT team, had a bolt-action rifle. Deputy Ryan Paisley had a 9mm HK MP5 submachine gun. Deputy Jay Lawhorn and Knavel had assault rifles. As they pulled up between the barn and row of cages, 2 tigers started out of the barn towards them. The animals were only about 10 or 12 feet away. "It took us kind of by surprise," said Knavel, "so those animals were put down. From where they were, they could see a man's body, flat on its back. A white tiger was atop him. It stood up," said Knavel, "and was standing there." He reported back to the sheriff that whether the body was Thompson's or someone else's, it was deceased. At 6:04 p.m., this information was shared on the police radio. That is what all 5 of them could learn for now, because they were urgently redeployed to the southern end of the property, where some big cats had been spotted readying to cross the boundary fence. First they had to deal with a male African lion that managed to run between some junk cars after the first shot. There were dozens and dozens of old cars and RVs and tractors parked in clumps of rusted metal around the hillside, weeds growing around them. As they moved toward the lion, other escapees spread over the hillside. They used the truck to give themselves elevation, trying to engage the animals from 70 to 100 yards away, firing on them 2 at a time until they were down. Knavel's tactic was to shoot for the head a couple of times, then move onto the body and then keep putting rounds in it. "I was sick shooting these animals because they didn't ask to be here," he said. After a while, the 4 shooters ran low on ammo and called for more, and they eventually headed back towards where the body of Thompson was. The white tiger had gone. Nearby, they found bolt cutters and a stainless steel Ruger 357 Magnum revolver. The cause of death seemed to be a gunshot to the head. One detail Sheriff Lutz chose to release to the press at the time was that there was a sizable laceration on Thompson's head that was consistent with a big cat bite. Deliberately or not, he seemed to be implying that Thompson's body was, aside from the gunshot wound, suggesting a barrel in the mouth, otherwise fairly untouched. It wasn't quite that straightforward, though. "He had been dragged," said Knavel. "You were able to tell that he had laid at one spot for a while, and then he was dragged. It looked like by an arm, and then his pants and stuff had been pulled down, and he had been chewed on. There were also pieces of raw chicken scattered around near the body. Apparently, he wanted the animals to eat him." All evening it went on, the slaughter. Encounters with animals that would normally have been remembered for a lifetime were forgotten moments later as the next came along. Somehow no one was hurt. Given the situation, things could have been much worse. Up near the house, where no media could see them, the officers laid the dead animals out in rows, by species, to ease the counting. That's where this this famous heartbreaking photo was taken. It remains unclear who took it. All of the bodies together in the early morning light, whatever people knew of the real situation and of the hard decisions that had to be made. By the time the Columbus Zoo team had arrived at the holding area, it was dark. They were told that it wasn't safe for them to try to tranquilize anything because so many animals were circulating the property. Even when a tranquilizer dose is successfully administered, it needs about 10 minutes to take effect, and it was deemed impossible with so many animals running around. When the zoo people returned to the site at 5:30 the next morning, they had been joined by Jack Hanna. Hanna, famous for his TV shows and appearances, established his career at the Columbus Zoo. After the sheriff spoke with Hanna and talked him through what happened, he gave interview after interview. It probably made all the difference. Hanna was a trusted animal advocate, and he emotionally articulated his pain at the deaths that had taken place. His unequivocal insistence that the sheriff's department had no other options than to act as they did served as a powerful antidote to the other obvious narrative that a thoughtless small-town law enforcement brigade had murdered dozens of noble beasts because they were too dumb and trigger-happy to think of a better alternative. It's like Noah's Ark reckoning, he proclaimed, right here in Zanesville, Ohio. 49 animals would be confirmed dead. There was now only one unaccounted for, a macaque. Though no trace of it could be found dead or alive, it was eventually decided that it had most likely been eaten by one of the cats. 6 of Terry Thomas's animals survived. 3 were leopards, still in their cages. 2 more were the macaques kept in the living room of the house in 2 small bird cages. And finally, out back near an empty swimming pool, was a small grizzly bear, also in a bird cage. The house itself was disgusting. It was the most horrible smell, said Stoff. Garbage and feces, garbage bags filled with garbage that were knocked over, and the filth. It was very sad to see how someone had clearly lost their mind. There are no sane people that would ever live in those conditions. Thompson's wife, Marion, arrived around lunchtime. She had to be convinced that the survivors should be taken to the zoo for safekeeping. She was saying, "Please, Mr. Hanna, please don't take my children," says Hanna. Marion insisted on removing the macaques from the cages herself, waving off zoo personnel advice about the risk that she was taking. She would explain that she had spent $30,000 buying them, and that she used to sleep with a young female. Her bond with them certainly seemed real. Before she opened the cage, she sang them a lullaby, and they clung to her as she took them one by one to their carriers. It was decided that the dead animals be buried there and then on the property. Miss Thompson chose a spot. Thompson's body was taken from the scene for an autopsy at the Licton County Coroner's. At death, Terry William Thompson was 5'5" and weighed 174 pounds. He had been wearing a black t-shirt, blue jeans, and white briefs. His gallbladder had been removed earlier in life, and he was suffering from severe cardiovascular disease. The only notable substance in his blood was Benadryl. There was gray powder residue on his left hand that appeared to be from a gun that was fired. And then there was what the coroner described as a 5 3/4 by 4-inch gaping laceration involving the pubic region with the absence of genitalia. To spell it out, by the time the body was recovered, no part of his external genitalia remained. Where they should have been, there was nothing but a raw gap. That was Terry Thompson's final grotesque parting gift, a last meal for one of his animals, sometime before it too met its death by bullet on the sad night of October 18th, 2011, near Zanesville, Ohio. Well, that was truly a grotesque tale. What I still don't really understand is why the Columbus Zoo couldn't tranquilize any of the animals after they arrived. Maybe it's because of the danger from all the animals out of their enclosure. Either way, the police didn't seem like they had much of a choice. It was either that they let the animals roam and be a danger to the community, or contain the threat. May the souls of those majestic beasts rest in peace. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe, like, and share if you would also like to keep exploring our grotesque curiosity. We'll meet again in the darkness of the night.